Chapter 46, Disguised PT-5. I am Keith, the male cheetah said, stretching out his limbs and relaxing his posture. I am Hari, the female cheetah said, setting her forearms on the table and staring at Ruby. The two cheetahs had dark skin and long features, eyes slightly tilted and their irises large and round. The female had short dirty blonde hair, the male similarly colored, and both had dark red eyes, nearly amber in color. Cedric grunted, a sullen expression on his face, refusing to look at her. And you know me as Emmett, the dark-haired jaguar said, folding his arms and leaning back. I'm Rose, Ruby said. Hi. You are small, Hari accused her. Emmett sighed in exasperation. At that moment, the tiger poked his head in. I heard you guys fighting, he said. Just establishing an order, Emmett said, smiling. Rose here had to teach Cedric a lesson. The tiger nodded, leaving and closing the door. Emmett cleared his throat, addressing the group. Tonight we're going to raid the mice. Cedric frowned. Mice are too slow, he complained. And too easy. Don't worry, you won't be disappointed, Emmett chuckled. In fact, I think you'll find this to be the hardest one yet. When do we leave? Ruby asked, jittering a little. Do we have to go with the other people I saw? Patience, Emmett laughed. We need to agree on what we're doing first, and then we'll leave in about 2 hours, when the prey have just arrived home. He pulled out a small piece of paper, scanning it quickly before shredding it into confetti, the scraps littering the floor. Apparently we've come to an agreement of no theft tonight, he declared. Which is good, because at the previous rate we were going and we were about to collapse their little economic system. Keith spoke up. Hunt together or apart? Emmett thought for a moment. Together, he decided. As I've said, tonight's going to be tough, and we'll need to make sure that we catch them. Catch them? Ruby asked. You don't know yet, do you? Ruby shook her head. It's simple, Emmett explained. We hunt them, catch them, and then threaten them to shut up or else. We can't let anyone escape, because then those little bastards might find the courage to speak up. Oh, Ruby nodded. Glad you understand, he said, pulling out a pack of cards. This is your trial run, so you'll need to stay in this room where we can keep an eye on you. Ruby wanted to groan in frustration, but she held it in, instead getting up and walking around as the four silently played cards on the table. Ruby caught Hari staring at her a few times, the cheetah glancing up from her cards to watch her pace about the room. Ruby didn't recognize the variation of card game they were playing, so she sat down in the corner, rocking back and forth. She tried to sweep her cloak around herself, but caught nothing but air as she realized where she was. Wrapping her arms around her knees, Ruby put her head down and eventually dozed off, lulled to sleep by the sound of the four playing cards and the occasional disappointed grunts. Ruby jerked awake at the sound of Emmett's voice. Time to go, he said, pushing himself back and standing up, the chair scraping across the floor. He swept up the pile of cards as Ruby yawned and stretched out her legs, blinking away the tears. The other three faunas already stood by the door, eager to leave. She scrambled up, smoothing down her clothes and joining them at the door. Emmett led the way, opening the door and stepping into the hallway. The other faunas were also leaving, Emmett's group being one of the last to depart. Keep up, he told Ruby, each one of his steps increasing in speed as they neared the exit. By the time they left the house, Emmett was gracefully loping ahead, each one of his strides equaling 3 of Ruby's. The two cheetahs kept up with him, Cedric a little further behind. Ruby eagerly followed, dashing forward, careful not to use too much speed as she kept pace. Ruby didn't even bother to ask how far they were going, instead just enjoying the run, happy to have an excuse to dash about. They quickly left the outskirts of the town, taking a path toward a small town in the distance. They didn't meet anyone on the road, Emmett having timed the excursion so that most of the mice would have already gotten home by the time they arrived. The path split off into branches, each leading to a different section of the small town. Emmett stopped for a second, sniffing the air. This way, he said, picking one of the paths on the right. They slowed their pace, stealthily using the alley and the shadows to sneak closer to their target. Ruby couldn't keep track of the turns, so she followed the others closely. The streets were lit with lampposts, something that seemed to be characteristic of more populated towns. Emmett stopped across the street from a simple two-story house with a pointed roof. Ruby wondered why he chose this house, then realized that all of the nearby houses were either abandoned or empty, the inhabitants not yet returned. Two lights were shining through the shutters on the second floor, and a light was on at the first floor. "Have fun," Emmett said, leading them across the street. A stone pathway led up the door, a neatly trimmed lawn covering the front yard, the snow swept away. Emmett knocked on the door a few times, rapping urgently. Half a minute later, someone came to the door, a muffled voice coming from the inside. "Who's there?" "Delivery," Emmett grinned, his fangs showing. And I looked through the peephole, widening and quickly stumbling back. Emmett slammed his fist through the door, wooden splinters spraying everywhere, a black aura glowing around him as he wrenched the entire door off of the frame. A mouse faunus was sitting on the floor, dressed in pajamas and a nightcap. Lightning fast, Emmett shook the door off of his forearm and swiped at the mouse. The mouse squeaked and shoved himself back, barely avoiding Emmett's hands. "Sharon, get the gun." The mouse screamed, turning and running up the stairs, the two cheetahs taking off after him. A diminutive woman who had large mouse ears and was dressed in a nightgown peeked around the corner, gasping as she saw them. Emmett pounced, his shoes digging up the rug as he ran towards her. She quickly retreated, Ruby hearing cabinets slam open as the woman searched for the gun. Cedric and Ruby followed the cheetahs upstairs, the stairs creaking and cracking as they dashed up, instinctively chasing after the fleeing prey. As Ruby rounded the stairs and entered the hallway, she saw the mouse dive into a room, slamming the door shut behind him and locking the two out. They both snarled, slashing and pounding at the solid oak door, the frame beginning to give away. Another two screams came from two separate bedrooms as the cheetahs ravaged the door, Cedric and Ruby instantly turning towards the two sources and splitting up, Cedric running down the left side while Ruby ran towards the right. The screams seemed to call to her, telling her that there was potential food inside, that there was something she could kill. Locating a small bedroom, Ruby tried the doorknob, finding it locked. She twisted harder, the metal knob coming off in her hands, so she kicked the remnants of the lock, the wood giving away and the mechanism scattering across the floor. She began punching at the remaining pieces, blood smearing her split knuckles as the solid door slowly gave, the sight of her own exposed flesh combined with the terrified cries sending her into a frenzy. The screaming inside the room suddenly cut off, Ruby hearing a drawer open as she broke down the door. Stepping inside, she stared into the barrel of a gun, the weapon shaking in the faunus girl's hand. She was about the same age as Ruby and even shorter than her distinctive mouse ears nearly flattened against her head in fright. "I've got a gun," she trembled. "Stay back." Ruby only bared her teeth, taking a step forward, the gun firing with surprising force. The impact slammed into Ruby, bruising her but unable to penetrate her aura. Ruby was momentarily forced back a step, the girl staring in shock. More shots were fired, the seventh one finally going through her aura and catching her in the chest, sending her flying back and slamming into the wall. Blood leaked through the hole in her black sweater, the liquid barely distinguishable over the dark coloring. Ruby coughed blood, clutching her chest and crouching over, red smearing the wall behind her. The faunus girl began to look hopeful as she lined up her sights and prepared to fire again. And then the gun clicked empty, the faunus girl cursing and dropping it. Ruby choked out an amused laugh, straightening up and walking towards her. With a panicked squeal, the girl dove under her bed, hiding beneath the metal frame that was anchored to the floor. Feeling slightly better now, Ruby resumed her attack, tearing into the mattress, fluff flying everywhere. Cotton flew into the air as Ruby exposed the frame, the crying mouse under it visible. "Here mousy mousy mousy," Ruby taunted, grinning with blood-stained teeth. She shoved her arm between the coils, trying to grab the girl's leg. The mouse faunus cried out, instinctively kicking at her, bending Ruby's arm at an awkward angle and popping out her elbow and shoulder. Ruby growled in discomfort, retracting her arm and shoving it back into place. Gripping the sides of the frame, she began tearing at it, the metal shredding beneath her fingers, her fingertips growing ragged and bone being exposed as she ripped the metal frame into pieces. Cedric stepped into the room, holding a tear-stained boy up by his collar and smiling with delight. I already got mine, Rose, he crowed. His eyes widened as Ruby ripped the metal bed out of the floor, flinging it across the room as she dove for the exposed faunus underneath. The girl had already crawled out from under the bed, however, tugging open a tiny cabinet on the side of the wall and somehow managing to squirm inside. Ruby screamed in frustration, grabbing hold of the cabinet panels and ripping them off, Cedric barely dodging one as it came flying towards him. Ruby smashed the wall, dust flying up as she demolished the plaster, trying to open a hole large enough for herself to fit through. She immediately hit a stone wall, a few fingers cracking as she slammed her fists into it. Cedric heard the audible cracks, wincing. Holy shit, Rose, calm down. Ruby ignored him, every instinct in her body telling her to chase after the prey. Grabbing pieces of the bed frame she had dismantled, she began smashing at the wall, sparks flying and chunks of stone scattering across the floor. A few minutes later, all of the metal she had was warped and bent, Ruby resorting to wrapping what was left around her knuckles and slamming them into the wall. That's a passageway, Emmett observed, walking down the hallway, an unconscious faunus slung over his shoulder. They're in the attic. Ruby's head whipped towards him, taking a second to process the words. Emmett pointed toward a room at the end of the hallway, Ruby immediately dashing past him. Someone's been cooped up a little too long, Emmett laughed, eyeing the damage Ruby had wrought. Cedric rubbed his head, a little sore from where the board had clipped him. She's fucking insane, he muttered. Ruby ran into the room, the cheetahs already inside and snarling. The room was surprisingly high, accounting for extra space in the triangular roof. A trapdoor was in the ceiling, the ladder drawn up behind it and the panel closed. The cheetahs, despite being fast on their feet, couldn't make the jump, their fingers still a good foot short of the trapdoor. They prowled the floor, circling the opening and growling. Ruby immediately ran forward and leapt up, slamming her fist through the paneling and grabbing on. Someone screamed on the inside, Ruby recognizing it as the girl, and someone else cursed. The voices spurred her on, Ruby swinging herself up and smashing her other fist through the wood, grabbing onto the ledge, now hanging by her fingertips in midair. A slipper smashed into her fingers, the already cracked bones breaking even further as Ruby lost her grip and fell back down, landing in a crouch. Emmett and Cedric stood in the doorway, watching. Want to go help? Emmett asked Cedric. No way in hell, Cedric said, shaking his head. Emmett looked at the scene. They're trapped in there anyways, so we might as well let Rose have her fun, eh? Ruby jumped back up, again and again, each time dragging down pieces of the trapdoor. The cheetahs had backed off, content to watch as she slowly widened the opening. A shotgun poked out of the hole Ruby made, a gunshot echoing through the room as the dust slug hit Ruby in the shoulder, deadening her arm. Ruby hissed, one arm hanging by her side, desperate to get to the people inside. Emmett stepped forward, intending to interfere, but Ruby suddenly jumped up, throwing her entire body through the trapdoor. Gunshots echoed in the attic, and for a moment the room went silent as the gun ran empty, the predators intently listening. I guess that's it, Emmett said, walking towards the opening in the ceiling. And then screaming began again, sounds of thudding in the attic and the ceiling cracking. A blood-stained Ruby tumbled out of the opening, clutching both faunus and ripping at them with her good arm. A few more bullet holes peppered her chest, her sweater completely ruined. Ruby lost her grip on the male mouse, her bloody and broken fingers losing their grip on his arm, but she lunged forward, biting down on the girl's collarbone. The girl screamed, struggling and writhing, making her taste oh so much more delicious, Ruby gouging out a chunk of flesh from her neck. Then she was suddenly in the air, slamming into a wall. Emmett had kicked her away from the faunus, a frown on his face. Restrain yourself, Rose, he scowled. No killing, or else you'll get the council involved. Ruby lay on the ground, chewing and swallowing the meat in her mouth, blood leaking out of multiple torso wounds. More, she rasped. I want more. We'll do this again in a week or so, Emmett assured her, misinterpreting her words. He turned to the other three faunus, setting the female mouse on the ground. This was a success, he decided. What do you three think? Cedric slowly nodded, having enjoyed himself despite Ruby's insanity. The two cheetahs had scared the male mouse on the ground into silence, now looking back up at Emmett. I accept her, Hari said. Rose is a good hunter. Keith nodded. Rose is undisciplined, but she can do what we cannot. Good, good, Emmett said, happy that things had worked out. The man was frozen on the ground, paralyzed in fear. His daughter was shivering and clutching her ragged shoulder, stemming the blood flow. The boy had curled up next to the daughter, huddling next to her and trying to ignore the predators staring down at them. The woman was just beginning to wake up, looking around groggily. If you can keep your mouths shut, we'll just leave right now and stop bothering you grass eaters, Emmett said, grinning. But if we hear a peep out of any of you, we're gonna come back and do even worse. Understand? Only the man was cognizant enough to respond, nodding shakily. Good. Emmett picked Ruby up under her arms, Ruby involuntarily coughing to prevent her lungs from filling with blood, and left the room, Cedric behind him. The cheetahs gave the family one last hiss before leaving, making them flinch. I'm okay, Ruby coughed, gently pushing Emmett away and standing up on her own. Emmett looked at her in surprise. You don't look okay. Ruby took a few deep breaths, rolling her neck and joints and popping back the dislocated parts. She reset her broken fingers, pulling them back into place and realigning the bones. The cheetahs stared at her, Cedric looking away in disgust as she fixed herself. I'm good, she repeated, yawning and popping her jaw. She wiped her face, realizing that her sweater was beyond repair. That was fun, Ruby said, smiling. What do we do now? Glad you enjoyed it, Emmett said. Now we disperse and go home. Meet us in the bar every night, and I'll tell you when we're doing another raid. Alright, Ruby said, walking to the closet and rummaging around. Don't mind me, I'm just looking for some new clothes. Cedric and the two cheetahs left without a word, jumping down the stairs and strolling out of the front door. I need to stay and make sure you don't go back and kill them, Emmett said, unmoving. Ruby shrugged as she found a brown jacket, slipping it on. Alright, she said. I'm going to go home now. Emmett walked down the stairs, Ruby right behind him. This goes without saying, but you'll need to keep this a secret from everyone, no matter how much you want to tell any of your friends. Of course, Ruby exclaimed incredulously. I'm not going to lose the opportunity to have this much fun. She quickly hid her downcast expression as she realized that she would have to tell Maya. You live with Maya, right? Emmett suddenly asked, as though he were reading her mind. Yup, Ruby responded, wondering where he was going with this. Emmett opened the front door. She probably already knows what we're doing, so you won't need to make an excuse for where you've been. Ruby paused. What do you mean? She's just like those other cops, Emmett explained. Hand her some money, and she won't give a shit. I've been hinting at what we've been doing for weeks now, and she hasn't done anything. That's, good to hear, Ruby said, surprised by how well Maya had been playing her role. She looked around, not recognizing where she was. Can you give me directions? Ruby asked. I'm lost. Emmett frowned. Remember the way this time, he said, gesturing for her to follow. The two started making their way back, staying in the shadows, heading for Maya's house. Chapter 47, Disguised PT-6. Emmett dropped her off at one of the paths leading to the police housing district. The two had made their way back to the main city from the mouse community, Emmett sprinting ahead and Ruby barely able to keep up, still injured. But she hid it well, and Emmett didn't notice or just didn't comment on anything. You're one tough snake, he said, eyeing Ruby's bloody appearance. I'd love to see you hunt some of the tougher prey. Ruby nodded, smiling. I'd be glad to, she said, exposing her sharp teeth. Emmett gave a throaty chuckle, walking back into the city and disappearing into the night. The moment the jaguar was out of sight, Ruby sat down heavily, taking deep gasps and waiting for her vision to stop swaying. She had put on a strong front for the four other faunas, masking her injured movements and stalling for time when she was searching for the jacket. Now she leaned back against the wall, head tilting upwards as she looked up into the blurry night sky. The bullet holes were healing on the surface, but she keenly felt the tunnel dug by each one, her lungs still leaking a little. Her sweater had clotted most of the blood, the fabric now stiff, but she had still lost a lot of blood beforehand. It was past midnight now, the moon bright overhead as Ruby slowly got up, still a little unsteady. Her arms and legs were trembling a little, the symptoms of her dangerously low blood pressure coming, her rage and adrenaline run down. A few people were still walking home as Ruby stumbled back into the city, looking for all the world like a drunk trying to make her way home. No one paid attention to her as she lurched from the shadows, her brown jacket doing a good job of hiding any dried blood, the pulled-up hood hiding her matted hair and stained face. Ruby kept her fingers in her pockets, the broken and ragged tips still not healed. Ruby's extremities were cold, her head feverish, her heart beating rapidly as her body went into overdrive, trying to compensate for the massive blood loss. Her foot couldn't raise itself in time, hitting a slightly raised edge of sidewalk and sending her stumbling to the ground. She lay there for a while, catching her breath. "Are you okay?" Ruby looked up, staring in shock as Allie stood there. And then she blinked, the illusion disappearing, a doe faunus with similar features but a different eye color and mouth shape standing over her. She screamed upon seeing Ruby's face, her voice abruptly ending in a gurgle as Ruby pulled her down and put both hands to her throat, using her body weight to pin her down and choke her. She scrabbled at Ruby's arms, the jacket denying her purchase. Ruby squeezed harder, the doe's eyes rolling upwards as her brain stopped receiving blood, eventually fainting. Ruby sat back, gasping for breath, exhausted by the effort. The run back from the mouse community had greatly tired her, and now she barely had any strength left. Looking around and finding the streets empty, Ruby dragged the doe to a bench, propping her up. She wanted to eat her, but she also didn't want the council to be alerted by the death and have them crack down on their nightly activities. Rummaging through the doe's handbag, Ruby felt around and triumphantly pulled out a miniature tablet, taking it and leaving the unconscious doe faunus. She walked into an alley, one hand on the wall for balance as she swiped the tablet open. Ruby stumbled around for a while, getting some distance before the doe woke up and turning down a few more alleyways. It took quite a few tries, but she eventually had Maya's number dialed, sliding to the ground and placing the tablet next to her as she waited for Maya to pick up. Maya's face appeared on the screen. "Hello." Holding the tablet up, she pointed it at her face, smiling wearily at the rabbit faunus. "Hey there, Maya," Ruby whispered. "Can you pick me up?" "Red." Maya gasped. "What the hell happened to you?" The background in the screen shifted as Maya laid the tablet down on the table, throwing on clothes. "Where are you? And how did you get the tablet?" "I commandeered it," Ruby said weakly. "I need a quick nap." "Stay with me, Red," Maya ordered, running out of the house and slamming the door shut. "Tell me where you are." Ruby sighed, tired, using her hands to push off of the ground and crawling to the corner, peeking out of the alley. The streetlight illuminated the intersecting street signs, Ruby barely able to see the letters in the dim glow. She crawled back to the tablet, cheek pressed to the ground, not even bothering to get up. "Second Street, I think," Ruby blinked, her eyes unable to focus. "Good night." "Damn it, Red." The last thing Ruby heard was sound of Maya cursing, the words growing tinny and muffled as she faded out of consciousness. "Red, wake up. Or else I'm taking you to the hospital, damn the consequences." Ruby groaned, her eyelids heavy as she struggled to wake up. Maya was crouched over her, frantically checking her wrist for a pulse. Her jacket was zipped open, her sweater bunched up around her shoulders so Maya could see the extent of her injuries. "No hospital," Ruby muttered. "Just need food. Meat." Maya paused, hearing Ruby's words. "Meat?" she asked, confused. "You need intravenous fluids and surgery. You've got bullet holes everywhere and I can't even feel your pulse. You shouldn't even be conscious right now." Ruby grabbed her hand, staring into her scarlet eyes. "I need food," she pleaded. Maya looked at her for a second, realizing the futility of arguing with her. Fine," she conceded. "If you die, it's not my fault." "Thanks," Ruby called out. Ruby was going back to sleep when she heard a motorcycle roar, the tires screeching as it took off. She quickly opened her eyes, catching a glimpse of Maya's blue uniform as the motorcycle rounded the corner, its purring fading into the distance. "Cool," Ruby whispered to herself. She dozed off again, waiting for Maya's return. The motorcycle woke her up a few minutes later, Ruby having been listening for its distinctive sound. Maya pulled off her helmet, flipping down the kickstand and getting off of the motorcycle. She took a large parcel out of her messenger bag, the object wrapped in many layers of brown paper. I got your meat, Maya said, holding out the package. Let me help you up, and I'll cook for you when we get home. Give it to me, Ruby said. Please, she amended, seeing Maya's face. You're going to eat it raw? Maya asked, surprised. Ruby nodded, and Maya handed her the wrapped meat. The blood smelled stale and the meat was cold, but Ruby was hungry and didn't care, her body demanding resources so that it could continue healing. She paused for a second, looking up. Do you, want to go anywhere else? Maya shook her head, grinning despite looking a little sick. I haven't seen a human eat raw meat before, she explained, interested. Go on, I've got a strong stomach. She stared in horrified fascination as Ruby tore into her meat, her sharp teeth easily ripping through the flesh and shredding it. The 3 pounds of steak quickly disappeared as Ruby devoured them in large bites, barely chewing before swallowing. When the meat was all gone, she wiped her mouth, panting, looking expectantly at Maya. What? Maya asked. I didn't know you would eat so much. That meat was supposed to last for at least a few more meals for you. It's fine, Ruby assured her quickly. I'm good for now. Even as she spoke, she felt her lightheadedness begin to fade, her body churning out new blood cells and restoring blood to her extremities. So you weren't grossed out? Ruby asked, Maya sitting down next to her. Nah, the rabbit fauna said. Besides, it's just food, right? Just not in the form I'm used to seeing people eat it in. Ruby smiled, Maya's statement making her happy. Thank you, Ruby said, leaning in for a hug. Maya said, poking her bare chest. You're covered with blood, and all that's keeping you decent as a bra. Ruby glanced down, blushing, quickly pulling her sweater down. A piece came off in her hand, the black fabric completely torn around the edges. Yeah, you're going to need new clothes, Maya observed. Your jeans are all dirty too. Ruby shrugged, zipping her jacket up. I don't know when I'll get my paycheck, she said. So I don't know when I'll be able to buy some clothes. Maya gave her a hug, Ruby's jacket having only a little bit of dried blood. Like I said, I'll lend you my money. Pay me back whenever. Ruby enjoyed the hug, Maya's chest pressing against her. The rabbit let out a sigh. For a second, I thought you were dead, she confessed. I mean, I stabbed you with a knife before, and once again, I'm sorry about that, but this time you were completely pale and I could barely feel your pulse. I'm glad you're okay now. Maya hugged her tightly, then tried to pull back. Red, you can let go, she said, Ruby clinging onto her. Ruby didn't want to let go, but she eventually did, both of them just sitting against the wall and staring into the sky. So what happened? Maya asked. Ruby's stomach growled. Can we get some more meat, and then talk at home? Ruby asked. You have a motorcycle. That, Maya said, standing up and holding out a hand. I borrowed one from the police station so I could find you faster. Told them it was an emergency. Ruby took her hand and pulled herself up. It's really cool, she gushed. I really like it. Is there any chance you could keep it? Maya shook her head. I don't have enough dust to refuel it, so after we get some more food we're going to need to bring it back to the police station. Ruby complained. They hopped onto the bike, Maya putting on the helmet and Ruby wrapping her arms around Maya. Maya sighed. Red, move your arms down and put your hands back to where they belong. Ruby grimaced in disappointment, an opportunity lost, as she moved her arms to encircle Maya's waist instead. The motorcycle was incredibly speedy, the powerful dust motors letting hurtle down the streets. Ruby briefly thought about Yang, then instantly crushed the thought. Less than a minute later, Maya braked to a stop in front of a butcher shop. You go in this time, Maya said, pulling out a wallet. I think I've ruined my reputation enough. Ruby took the lead Maya proffered her. How did you even buy the meat in the first place? I thought they didn't serve herbivores. I said it was for a friend. Why the hell did I say that? Maya groaned. I should have just told them to shut up and listen to the police officer. Ruby laughed, walking to the door and pushing it open. A bear fauna sat at the counter, snoring in his chair, his apron askew and an open book in front of him. Ah, hello, Ruby said tentatively. Can I buy something? The bear snorted, coming awake and shaking his head. He stared at Ruby for a second, sniffing the air. What do you want? He asked. Ruby looked at the selection of meats. I'll take 2 pounds of ribs and 2 pounds of roast, she decided, pointing them out. The bear grunted, grabbing the chunks of beef and setting them down on the scale. He checked the weight, adjusting it, then rang her order up. Ruby paid with Maya's lean, taking back the change and picking up the meat. Good night, Ruby said, but the bear was already leaning back in his chair, trying to go back to sleep. Maya was waiting for her outside, the bike revved up. Ruby memorized the route as Maya drove back to the police station, stopping in front of a rectangular building clearly labeled, Police. A gated parking area was off to the side. Maya pulled a card out of her pocket and pressed it to the scanner, the gates clicking and sliding open. Wait here, she said, wheeling the motorcycle in. Ruby sneaked around, observing the building. It was made of yellow and white brick, the color barely distinguishable in the dim moonlight. The ground floor was lit, but the windows were curtained, Ruby unable to see who was inside. Boo, Maya said, making Ruby flinch. Come on, let's go, she said, laughing. Stop spying, nobody's doing anything worth looking at. Ruby grinned at her. Guilty as charged, she said, stepping away from the windows. They started walking home, a bit of light snow beginning to fall. Ruby held the bag of meat in one hand, the other hand stuffed into her pocket. Maya walked alongside her, both of them taking their time, coming down from the excitement of that night. How did you get so injured? Maya asked. Why didn't Emmett call for help or bring you to the hospital? I got shot a few times. I can see that, Maya said wryly. They didn't know I was so badly injured. They didn't see you get shot? Maya asked incredulously. What were you doing? They did see me get shot, Ruby assured her. But I managed to pretend I was fine until Emmett dropped me off. Why did Emmett drop you off? Ruby hesitated for a second. I got lost again, she admitted. I didn't know where we were going and didn't keep track of the street names, so Emmett showed me the way back to your house. Maya sighed, realizing that each question brought up a whole set of new ones. So how did you pretend that you weren't hurt? Well, beside from the blood loss, I was mostly fine, Ruby said, rubbing her bullet wounds. My lungs healed up pretty quickly and I don't think I was hit anywhere else important. I was mostly just exhausted from running with Emmett and pretending I was fine. Maya stared. You ran at Emmett's speed in that condition. She shook her head in amazement. I think you may have tried a little too hard to fit in, Red. Ruby shrugged. I didn't want to show them any weakness. You're right, I did take a little too much damage, but I didn't want to hesitate in front of them. Maya looked conflicted. Ruby, do you want to stop doing this whole undercover job? I'll understand if you want to stop after what happened. Many officers have left undercover operations because of smaller issues. Ruby shook her head immediately, surprising Maya. No, it's fine, she said. And besides, it'll be weirder if I just suddenly stop going, and then they might start suspecting you, too. Thanks, Maya said, relieved. You're my only hope in fixing this whole mess. And trust me, you're going to end up helping a lot of people. Ruby nodded. They walked the rest of the way in silence, waiting until they got to the privacy of their home before talking about the events of that night. Ruby's head was down, Ruby lightly snoring as Maya prepared some tea. The thunk of the mug hitting the wooden table woke her, making her look up into Maya's face, squinting from the bright lamplight. Come on, Maya said, pulling out her tablet and setting it on the table. Let's get this over with, while it's still fresh in your mind. Ruby yawned, rubbing her eyes and stretching her arms out on the table. Don't you need to go to work tomorrow? No, today's already Saturday, she said delightedly, checking the clock. I don't work on Saturdays or Sundays. Picking up the mug, Ruby took a gulp of the bitter tea, making a face. Too strong, she complained, sticking out her tongue. Bleh. Maya ignored her, swiping at the tablet. Alright, Red, we're recording now. So what happened after we left the bar? For context, I tried to follow you, but I couldn't risk getting caught and stayed a little too far back, so I lost you early on. We moved really fast, and I couldn't actually keep track of where we were going. I know we ended up somewhere on the edge of town at an abandoned building. Their hideout. Ruby nodded. How large was it? Tell me anything you remember, such as its color, size, building material, and so forth. Ruby thought for a second. 2 stories, and all the windows were boarded up. I couldn't tell what color it was because there wasn't enough light, but I know it was a dark color. I'm not sure what it was built out of. Red. The description fits many abandoned homes throughout the city, Maya said. Anything else? Well, it's their secret hideout, so couldn't you just smell it and see if anyone was there recently? Maya shook her head. The problem isn't determining whether the house was used, it's the fact that I probably won't be able to find it by myself. Sorry, Ruby apologized. I'll try to see if there's anything unusual about the house next time. Maya nodded. What happened next? Well, a tiger faunus opened the door for us. Oh, and after we left the bar, another female cheetah joined us. Hari, right. Yup. So we went in, and Emmett did a pat down on me for bugs and stuff, and then we introduced ourselves and they played cards for the next 2 hours. Slow down, Maya said. Did anyone else join you? Ruby shook her head. Just us 5, Cedric, Emmett, Hari, and Keith. Emmett made me stay in the room with the rest of them so that they could keep an eye on me. Would you say that they were being oddly suspicious? Ruby thought about what Emmett was like. No, she decided. It was pretty professional, and Emmett did a really standard, well, I don't know how to describe it, but it was like he was trained to do pat-downs. You know, like, using the back of your hands, not pressing too hard, avoiding contact with my parts, that sort of thing. Interesting, Maya noted. Did it seem as if he had military training of some sort? I can't really tell, Ruby said after a few seconds. I don't know how people with military training act. But I know that he was really calm and he always seemed to be in control. What happened after the 2 hours? Ruby realized where the conversation was going, her heart starting to race. We raided the mouse faunus community. Maya leaned forward. What did this raid consist of? Did they want anything specific? No, they were just there to hunt, Ruby answered. And I think I remember Emmett specifically mentioning that we weren't going to be stealing cash. Are you sure? Maya asked. A few of the reports have been about stolen belongings or lien. They have definitely stolen before, Ruby agreed. Emmett said something about taking too much, and that they were going to take less in the future. Maya took a breath, nodding, then stared into Ruby's eyes. Now, what happened during the hunt, Red? Ruby didn't know if she was excited by the memories or scared by the fact that Maya was so close to finding out, but she shuddered involuntarily when Maya said those words. We attacked a mouse faunus family, Ruby whispered. How many people? 4. The mice had a daughter and a son. Was anyone killed? Maya asked, dreading the response. No, Ruby said, relieved by how Maya had phrased the question. Maya looked surprised. None of the predators were killed either. Ruby shook her head. I think I was the only who got shot, actually. How did you get shot so much anyways? Maya asked. I still can't believe that you're fine already. I'm tough, Ruby laughed, trying to alleviate Maya's worries. And some of them had guns, and I guess they picked me as their target. Were any of the faunus injured? The question seemed to come in slow motion, Ruby taking a second to register the words in her mind, refusing to accept it. She felt her blood turn cold, her throat closing up, not willing to mention her part in the bloodshed. Maya saw her hesitation. Just a few details, Red. Tell me what you need to, tell me anything that you think is important. Ruby let out a shuddering breath, trying to calm herself, wondering she was going to say. I don't know about the condition of the mother or the son, but I know that the daughter was bitten and their father was handled pretty roughly, she said, deciding to go with the bare truth. Maya ran a hand through her hair. Normally, at this point I would have asked you if you committed any crimes or did something that you should not have done to stay undercover. But you've given me a good amount of information, and some things are best left unsaid, especially since you're not an actual cop. Ruby nodded, agreeing. I don't suppose you remember where the Fauna's house is? Maya asked hopefully. Ruby racked her memories, remembering that Emmett had told her to memorize the way. I can't remember the exact street names, Ruby said at last, smacking herself in the head and hoping that she would remember. But if we go there, I think I could lead you to their house. That's great, Maya said excitedly. Not really, Ruby said, frowning. They'll recognize me. That's fine, Maya said, dismissing her concerns. I'll get you a hoodie or something, and you can just point out their house when we drive by. Ruby yawned. So are we done now? Do you have anything else you'd like to add? Maya asked, putting a hand on the tablet. Ruby said, thinking. I think Emmett said something about doing this again in a week or so. Any specifics? Nope. Anything else? Ruby shook her head, and Maya stopped recording. So are we going to continue to go to the bar every night? Ruby asked. Maya nodded. You need to keep up your appearances so that they'll trust you more when you continue to participate in their activities. Ruby looked worried. But what am I going to do at the bar? I don't think I can drink, I don't really have anything to talk about, and I'm not even actually a snake faunus. Snake? Maya asked. That's what you're going with? Yup. You suggested it to me, remember? Yeah, Maya said, getting up and walking to a cabinet. I think I can solve your problem. Ruby got up, going over to Maya. What do you mean? You said you had nothing to do at the bar, right? Maya said, rummaging through the cabinet. What are you looking for? Ruby asked, also poking her head into the opening. Found it, Maya said triumphantly, turning and showing her 2 packs of cards. Ruby looked confused. How are those going to help? Maya gestured for her to take a seat, tapping the packs on the table and pulling out a deck of cards. Most people around here pass time by reading books, working, drinking, or playing a variety of games. We're not connected to the global network, so we don't have a lot of electronic leisure activity. She dealt the cards out, giving Ruby a few and taking some herself, setting the deck in the middle. A lot of people just meet up at the bar to play cards or dice or any other sort of gambling game. Maya remembered something, standing up again. Let me see if I can find the dice, she said brightly, rummaging through the cabinet again. Ruby groaned, realizing that it was going to be a long night. Chapter 48, Another Night in Town. It was nearly morning by the time Maya was done with her. The rabbit faunus had energetically explained all the rules, tips, and tricks, and what people would do to cheat. She told her what the standard betting amounts were, what happened when cheaters were found out, and so forth. So now you'll have something to do, Maya said happily, gathering up the cards. Ruby groaned. She had fallen asleep a few times, but Maya kept mercilessly shaking her awake. My head feels like it's going to explode. I can't believe you didn't know this game, Maya said, putting the cards away. I had other stuff to do, Ruby mumbled, her face on the desk. What time is it? Maya looked up. It's 6 a.m. Ruby jolted awake, tumbling out of her chair. I have to get back to camp. Maya stared at for a second. Oh shit, she said guiltily. I completely forgot. It's okay, Ruby assured her, beginning to strip. I can make it if I run back. Is your stuff still in the basement safe? Maya asked, standing up and stretching. I can go get it for you. Ruby nodded, handing her the key. Thanks, she said, pulling off her jeans. She ran to the bathroom, taking off her ruined underclothes and starting up the shower. Popping open the lenses case, she rinsed out the fluid and replaced it, then took off her contact lenses and dropped them inside. The shower was already hot, Ruby immediately soaping herself and scrubbing her hair. The black dye came out easily, rivulets of dark pigment going down the drain. The door creaked open. Here are your clothes, Maya said, dropping them on the floor. The keys are in the pouch. Thanks, Ruby called out, the door clicking shut. She stepped out of the shower half a minute later, looking around for a towel. Maya had put a fluffy white one on top of her clothes, so Ruby gratefully picked it up and began wiping herself dry. Wiping down the mirror and checking it one more time to make sure she looked normal, she put on her tattered combat skirt, pinning the cape to it and wrapping steel silk around herself. Yanking her belt up and securing her weapon, she stomped on her boots and ran out of the bathroom. "See ya, Maya," Ruby called, leaping onto the windowsill and grabbing the overhang. Maya waved from the counter. "Stay safe. Message me when you get back." Ruby flipped herself onto the roof, unfolding her scythe and wrapping the end with steel silk. Checking for guards, she threw it up into the wall and scaled the wooden structure. Stepping on top of her scythe, she jumped, clearing the wide walkway and soaring into the air, ripping her scythe out of the wall as she flew up. Having reached the maximum height of the trajectory of her flight, she fell back down the other side, flaring her aura and slamming feet first into the packed snow. She dissipated the impact by turning her momentum into a forward roll, coming up on 2 feet and immediately beginning to run. Her feet sank only slightly into the frozen snow, allowing Ruby to reach the edge of the clearing quickly. Finding her previously trodden path, she swiftly ran back to her campsite, keeping an eye out for her beowulfs. By the time she reached camp, she hadn't seen any of her Grimm. "They're probably asleep," Ruby reasoned, deciding not to worry about them. Sliding into the clearing, she breathed a sigh of relief, looking up at the pale blue sky. Now that she had made it in time, she relaxed, immediately feeling tired from the long day and the events of past few hours. Her body demanded rest, the healing taking its toll, so Ruby sat down in her tent, wrapping her cloak around herself and quickly falling asleep. Her dreams were filled with amorphous black shapes that eclipsed nearly all of the light, the darkness slowly surrounding her. And then the sound of her name woke her up. "You have got to be kidding me," Ruby thought to herself. "Red." Ruby raised her head up blearily, the sun barely shining through the opening at the top of the tent. "Maybe they'll go away if I don't answer them." "We know you're there." Ruby groaned. "Do you need anything?" she yelled back. They were silent for a moment, surprised that they had received a response. "I told you this was a stupid idea," she heard someone mutter. "Shut up," hissed another voice. "Do you want to eat or not?" "We heard that you can give us protection outside of New Haven," came the voice again. Ruby sighed, standing up and popping her joints. Her torso felt a little stiff, the muscles having healed together tightly, so Ruby rotated her back, stretching. All right, I'm coming," Ruby said, zipping open the tent and stepping outside. The pale sunlight barely affected her vision, allowing her to see a small group of 5 predator faunas standing in her clearing. They wore simple cloaks and were dressed in warm clothing, 3 of them holding rifles in their hands while 2 held compound bows. The ragtag group didn't look like the hunters Vincent had mentioned, their lack of uniforms and their mismatched weapons giving them away. She could identify 2 of them being some sort of cat, one of them being a type of canine, while the other 2 were recognizable as large-eared foxes. Upon seeing the swirl of red step out of the tent, one of the predators instinctively raised his rifle, aiming down the sights at her. "Stop that," a cat-eared one scolded, slapping the dog-eared one's weapon down. Ruby wasn't sure what types of cats or dogs there were, their ears in some vaguely familiar exotic shape she couldn't exactly pin down. "So, did Vincent send you?" "No," the dog-eared one immediately responded. "Please shut up already," the cat-eared one groaned. He sighed, rubbing his head. "No, we weren't, but you're supposed to be helping all of us, aren't you?" "I guess so," Ruby admitted. "What do you guys want?" "Guard us while we're hunting," the cat proposed. Ruby thought for a second. "Wait, aren't you guys supposed to be staying in New Haven?" "Told you this was a bad idea," the dog repeated. The cat kicked his shin. "Well, maybe if you tell me why you 5 are out here I can decide whether to help you," Ruby suggested. The cat faunus let out a sigh. "We're sick of eating grain and vegetables," he said. "And we don't have enough money to buy more meat." Ruby pointed to a mound of snow. "I have some frozen bear meat there, if you want any," she offered. They looked at each other. "How much do you have, and how old is it?" Ruby walked toward the pile. "It's been about a day or so." "Let me check." They backed away from her, staying out of her arm reach as she passed by them. Ruby swept away the snow, revealing the 2 bundles of tarp underneath. She opened them up one by one. "This one's the leftover organs," Ruby pointed out. "And this one has the meat." They immediately fell into discussion, the dog Faunus insisting that he wanted to go back while the others talked about the dangers of accepting meat from an unknown human, mentioning her reputation a few times. A minute later, they stepped back, allowing the cat Faunus to speak. "The amount of meat you have isn't enough," he stated. "And no offense, but we don't want to take your supplies." Ruby nodded. "No problem," she said. "Are we going to go hunting now?" The cat nodded, motioning for her to follow them. "We're going to areas frequented by previous hunting expeditions. We've brought some bait, so we're going to need you to keep lookout and protect us while we're out there." Ruby felt a little hungry. "Should I bring some food? I haven't eaten breakfast yet." "We'll be back around noon, so it's your decision." Ruby decided that eating raw meat in front of strangers probably wasn't a good idea, so she decided to resist her hunger. "I'll be fine," she assured the cat. He nodded, taking the lead as he led the group through the forest. "So why don't you have enough money to buy more meat?" she asked the dog. The dog looked nervously at the cat, then decided to answer. "It's expensive, and we don't have steady jobs," he explained. "Bread and other vegetables are a lot cheaper." "The town leader gives us a tiny amount of money," the cat interrupted. "He thinks we can live on plants," he snarled, emphasizing the last word. "Can't you?" Ruby asked. "It's against our nature," he hissed. "The amount of money he gives us is enough if all we ate were plants. If we use that money to buy meat, we'll starve." This random hunting trip finally made sense to Ruby. "I understand," she said, nodding. They walked at a fast pace for half an hour, threading through the trees. The Faunus were too nervous to talk, so the silence wore on Ruby's mind, making her extremely bored. She spoke up. "So what do I call you guys?" The cat Faunus glanced at her, shushing the dog Faunus. "No names," he declared. "I don't want to get us in trouble with Vincent." "Okay," she responded, frowning a little. She wondered if she should continue to help them. Vincent could get mad at her for giving them assistance, which was an issue, but she did tell herself that she would help the Faunus at the settlement in any way possible. They soon arrived at the hunting spot, pulling open their packs and setting down bait. They took out large bags of corn, scattering it across the ground and throwing a few cobs into the mix. Ruby watched them with interest, wondering if she could emulate their hunting tactics. They were done in a few minutes, climbing up trees and taking their spots. The cat waved at her, motioning for her to get moving, away from the bait, so Ruby similarly climbed a tree, heading for the very top. The landscape was mostly white, a few areas dotted with some evergreens. She leaned back against the trunk, her legs dangling off the branch as she watched the world around her. She saw a few shapes moving through the trees, but nothing as dark and definitive as a grim. Remembering that she had to message Maya, she pulled the tablet out of her pouch, swiping it on. Unfortunately, it had no signal, Ruby futilely waving it around before giving up and putting it away. The wait was boring, Ruby having nothing to do as she looked around her landscape with her rifle scope. She caught sight of a few deer and possibly some rabbits, telling herself to resist the urge to shoot them and get the hunt over with. As time passed, Ruby wanted to just lay her head back and take a nap, but she forced herself awake, knowing that she had a job to do. 40 minutes later, a herd of deer passed by the bait, straying off their path and stopping to feed on the pile of corn. Gunshots rang out, Ruby watching from above as the deer scattered. One of them dropped dead, the other injured deer limping away, bleeding. Another arrow hit its chest, and its limb buckled as it collapsed. The cat Faunus looked up, waving to get Ruby's attention. He motioned for her to come down, so Ruby climbed down the tree, dropping from branch to branch. They were already beginning to tie the deer's limbs together as Ruby hit the ground. "That was fast," she commented. The cat Faunus shrugged. "The deer usually come near here in the mornings. Did you see any grim?" Ruby shook her head, pulling out her tablet and bringing up the map, noting the location. "Not a single one. By the way, do any of you know Vincent's messaging address?" The cat looked at her hesitantly. "I won't tell him about any of this," Ruby promised. "Think of this as my reward or something." "Why do you need his address?" the cat asked. "So if he needs to tell me something, he doesn't have to keep sending messengers out to wake me up in the morning." Ruby glared at them. Besides, if I wanted to tell him about you guys, I could just tell any of the guards. He'll know that someone told you, the cat Faunus decided, shaking his head. Go ask one of the guards if you need to talk to him about something. Alright, Ruby said, not pushing the issue any further. No Grim at all? The cat Faunus asked, going back to the original topic. Nope, Ruby repeated. That's odd, he muttered, turning to leave. The hunters had finished binding the legs of the deer. Each deer was carried by two Faunus, one holding the front end while the other held the back. The corn had mostly been swept up, a few kernels left on the disturbed snow. Sharing the burden between themselves, they carried the deer back to the edge of the village clearing, the return trip a little longer. Blood flowed out of the deer's wounds, twin trails of red painting the ice. The moment Ruby was able to see the wall, she immediately took out her tablet and sent a message to Maya, telling her that she was fine and that she had been on a hunting expedition. How are you guys going to get those deer into New Haven? Ruby asked curiously. You can't just walk in through the main gate, especially since you're not even supposed to be here. If we don't tell you, are you going to follow us? Ruby grinned. Yup. The Faunus sighed, his ears twitching in agitation. There's an auxiliary gate in the back. We have Faunus sympathetic to our cause manning the guard towers. Huh, I didn't know there was another entrance, Ruby exclaimed, watching as the four Faunus carrying the deer began to circle around clearing, staying in the tree line. If I'm not mistaken, you have a tablet, the cat stated. If you want to continue helping us, we can message you if we need any protection. Sure, Ruby replied, giving him her address. If I don't respond, then I'm probably busy with something. The cat looked at her strangely. Busy with what? Oh, you know, chopping down trees and other helpful stuff, Ruby said vaguely. The cat Faunus didn't question her, saying his goodbyes and following his group as they walked away. Ruby immediately headed for a guard tower, hoping to find a guard that would be willing to give her Vincent's address. It was late in the morning now, the sun hanging high in the sky. The guard rotation was apparently still the same, Ruby first finding the avian Faunus she had met previously. You again, he said, frowning. I just need one thing, Ruby called up. Then I'll stop bothering you. Go on, he said, motioning with his hand. Can you give me Vincent's messaging address? The guard hesitated. This way you guys won't be sent out just to talk to me, Ruby commented. If Vincent can message me whenever he needs me, I can respond faster, too. The guard took a moment to decide, finally giving Ruby Vincent's address. Don't bother him or annoy him with petty issues, the guard warned. Now stop bothering me. Ruby was already walking away, head bent over the tablet as she typed out a message to Vincent. She made it clear that he should message her instead of sending people as messengers, reminding him of how efficient electronic mail was and how it was much more convenient. She got a reply almost instantly, Vincent asking her how she had found out about his address and what she was messaging him from. I got your messaging address from a guard. Not his fault, I kept pestering him. I have my own tablet. So can you just message me if you need me? He replied immediately. Good idea, did not know you had a tablet. I will stick to electronic messages in the future. No hunting this weekend. Thanks, Ruby simply responded, and put the tablet back into her pouch. She headed back to her campsite, wanting some food and some sleep before doing anything else. Unwrapping the tarp, Ruby took out the last few scraps of organs, skewering them on a sharp branch and setting them down next to the unlit fire. She grabbed a few logs and some tinder, starting up a fire and placing the meat over it. After waiting for what seemed like an eternity, the meat had finally thawed out, so Ruby grabbed the organs and devoured them. Wiping her mouth with snow, she lay down on the ground, immediately going to sleep. Ruby woke up as the sun was setting, the orange sky peeking through the opening in the tent ceiling. The fire was a pile of ashes now, hours having passed. Getting up and looking outside her tent, Ruby was surprised to see that her Beowulfs weren't there. They were usually awake by this time, and if they were awake they always greeted Ruby before going anywhere. Ruby spent a few fruitless minutes looking around her campsite, checking their usual sleeping places and looking for any signs of them. There were a few tracks, but looked old, the edges of the footprints crumpled. There weren't any signs of their recent kills, nor were there any leftover viscera or blood. She started to panic a little, wondering if they were dead or lost. Or maybe they just left me, Ruby thought. Maybe that's for the best. Sitting down, she indulged in a little self-pity, wiping away a few of the tears that leaked out. The loss was softened by the fact that Ruby hadn't really seen them in a while, but she still felt sad, her movements a little mechanical as she walked back to camp, her heart heavy. By the time she reached her campsite, she had resolved not to bother Maya with this issue. She couldn't rely on Beowulfs for company forever, and perhaps their leaving signaled the fact that she needed to start moving on with her life. Pulling out her tablet, she checked it for messages, finding 2 unread ones from Maya. The first one was sent 2 hours or so ago, simply reading, "I'm awake, don't forget about the bar tonight." The second one read, "I'm going to call you if you don't wake up by 6. Ruby quickly typed a message back, telling her that she was awake and would be heading over shortly. She grabbed the tarp of meat, slinging it over her shoulder and tying it into place with steel silk. The added weight made her boots crunch through the snow, slowing her down a little. By the time she reached the wall, it was already dark, the sun having dropped below the horizon. Making sure her package was secure, she tightened the bindings a little more before beginning her climb. Her fingers ached, the freshly healed bones complaining under the load. Ruby paused before climbing over the parapet, looking and listening for any sign of guards. Having made sure it was safe, Ruby scrambled up, throwing her bundle over the other side of the wall and hearing it thud onto the ground. She followed after it, rappelling down the wall and jumping the last few feet. Dragging the bundle to the door, Ruby knocked a few times. Maya opened the door almost immediately, looking her over. "What's that?" Maya asked, stepping aside and ushering her in. "Bear meat, 100 pounds of it or so. Can I put it in the storage box?" Maya looked doubtful. "I don't think that's going to fit, Red." "I'll cut it up," Ruby proposed. "And then I can stuff it in." "You can try," Maya said, opening the basement door. The bundle thumped down the stairs, the steps creaking as Ruby lugged it to the basement. Sliding open another panel on the side of the wall, Ruby revealed a small hollow space that was packed with snow, the pieces of meat she had bought earlier also inside. Maya had taken advantage of the already cold temperature of the basement, stuffing snow into the box to keep the entire thing below zero. Ruby took out the chunks of flesh, the pieces large and awkward and hard to fit into the box. Taking out her scythe, Ruby sliced the meat into small sections, stacking the pieces in the storage space and shoving it in. She carved the bones out and left the meat behind, reducing enough of the mass so that Ruby could shove all of the perishable flesh inside. "There we go," Ruby said happily, picking up the bones and tucking them under her arm. "What are you going to do with those?" Maya asked, walking back up the stairs. Ruby thought for a moment. "Can I make soup out of them?" Maya chuckled. "Why are you asking me?" They walked into the kitchen, Ruby looking around the cabinets. "Do you have a pot or something?" Maya handed her a large cast iron pot, a little dusty from disuse. Ruby spent the next few minutes cutting the bones down and starting up a soup, filling the stove with wood and starting the fire. She rinsed off the pot and added a reasonable amount of water, dropping the bones into it and placing it on the stove. Maya looked a little conflicted about the smell of bone and blood filling her kitchen, her nose twitching a little. Ruby toweled off her hands, covering the pot with a lid. "So do I just leave this here or what?" Maya shrugged. "I don't usually cook meat, but I'd imagine that it's like a stew. I think you can just let it cook slowly." She pointed toward the bedroom. "I had to get you new clothes again. Try not to destroy them this time." The mention of her disguise made Ruby freeze. "Oh crud. I forgot I had a job." It took Maya a moment to realize what she meant. "You mean your dishwashing job?" Ruby nodded. "I thought I would be able to earn some money or something," Ruby said sadly. "I can't believe I completely forgot. Didn't you say you had to go hunting in the morning? How were you expecting to hold down a job if Vincent keeps asking you for help?" It wasn't Vincent this time, Ruby remembered. It was just a few carnivores who sneaked out of the other gate. They wanted me to help protect them while they went hunting. Maya perked up. "Really?" she asked. Why couldn't they just buy meat? They said that it was too expensive, and that they were sick of eating vegetables all day. Maya looked thoughtful. It's true that meat is expensive, but I'm guessing that they didn't have jobs. Did you ask them anything about that? Ruby shook her head. One did say that he couldn't hold a steady job, though. Well, some Fanas just refuse to work or they're too lazy to work, Maya explained. Other actually can't find jobs or they turn down the menial jobs that they can find. Like being a dishwasher, Ruby concluded, walking toward the bedroom. Can we stop by their restaurant first? I need to apologize for ditching them, if nothing else. Sure, Maya agreed. You don't want to ruin your reputation before you've even done anything. Ruby nodded, shutting the bedroom door behind her.